In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Next Sunday is Stewardship Sunday, so this Sunday I want to talk about money. And I want to talk about tithing, T-I-T-H-I-N-G, which is a word that some people use in church when they're talking about giving money. So when people say they tithe, we hear them saying they give money to the church. Actually, that is not exactly what the word tithing means. Tithe is an old English word that English-speaking people like us eventually began pronouncing or mispronouncing tenth. And that's what the old English word meant. Tithe is a word that means 10%, and it's not really a church word. It's a secular word. It's a word that was originally used by farmers and merchants and mathematicians and other people who worked with numbers and fractions and percentages. The word got inside the church because from the beginning, Christians have given 10% of their income to the church as a way of showing gratitude to God. That's tithing. But that didn't begin in the church. That began with the ancient Hebrews. It began with the first of the ancient Hebrews. In the book of Genesis, as Abraham is having his first adventures in the Promised Land, he is met one day by a mysterious person named Melchizedek, who introduces himself to Abraham as a priest from a place most English Bibles call Salem, which is an old English way of mispronouncing the Hebrew word shalom, which is the Hebrew word that means peace. Shalom, Salem, peace. Okay, many hundreds of years later, the mysterious place called Shalom was renamed Yerushalom, or as English people like to say, Jerusalem, city of peace. Literally, Jerusalem, Yerushalom, means the foundation of peace. So, there is this mysterious priest from this mysterious place called Peace, who goes to meet Abraham in the Promised Land. And when he meets Abraham, this priest offers Abraham bread and wine and a blessing. And then Abraham, in turn, offers the priest a tenth of everything he has. Abraham tithes to the priest. That's where tithing begins in the Bible. Now, I just want to make one observation about tithing in that story. When Abraham tithes to Melchizedek, he is not paying the priest for the bread and the wine. And he's not paying for the blessing. The blessing and the bread and the wine are given as gifts. No strings attached. The tithe is offered in response, not in exchange for the gifts, but as an expression of gratitude for the gifts. That's tithing. And that mysterious story about tithing in the book of Genesis becomes very important to later Hebrew tradition. By the time the Psalms in the Old Testament are being written, the priest of peace who administers bread and wine has become associated with the Messiah. And the way faithful people show their gratitude to God in the Hebrew tradition is to do what Abraham did. You take 10% of everything you have and you give it to a priest. You tithe to the temple. That's what's happening in this morning's gospel. Jesus and his disciples are in the temple, and they're watching people tithe. The people they happen to be watching happen to be rich, so the tithes are big tithes. 10% of a fortune is a small fortune, but it's not the amount that matters. It's the percentage. It's the tithe. That's what faithful people do. But in the Old Testament, tithing is just the beginning of what faithful people do. On top of the tithe, faithful Hebrew people made offerings, which are special gifts given on special occasions. Like, for instance, after a wedding or a bar mitzvah, you might make a special gift of gratitude to the temple, just like some Christian people today will make a special gift to the church on the occasion of a wedding or a baptism. And then on top of that, faithful Hebrew people would give alms to the poor. That is, they would give money to the poor, just as some Christians today will give money or food to, for instance, a food pantry. That's the Hebrew tradition. That actually is about 90% of Hebrew religion. The foundation of Hebrew religion is gratitude. The substance of Hebrew religion is giving. Sacrificial giving as an expression of thanks to God. And the baseline of the giving in the Hebrew tradition is the tithe. All of that was immediately imported into the Christian tradition because, of course, the first Christians were Jewish. And the practice has continued. To this day, most churches, most pastors, and most traditions, including our tradition, teach tithing as what faithful people do. It is the minimum standard of giving. It's the biblical standard of giving. It's the only standard we've got. In the Old Testament, it's a commandment. Is it a commandment in the New Testament? Did Jesus ever command tithing? I don't think he ever commanded it. All we know is that he commended it. Every time tithing comes up in the gospel, Jesus commends the practice, but he only commends the practice on his way to critiquing the practitioners. So, for instance, in Matthew's gospel one day, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, who are very faithful tithers. They give not only 10% of their income, they give 10% of the produce of their gardens. And not just their vegetable gardens, they give 10% of the produce of their little herb gardens. So these guys are meticulously pinching off 1/10 of the little leaves on their mint plants, and fastidiously counting out 1/10 of the little seeds their cumin plants produce to give to the temple. That is faithful tithing. And Jesus praises them for it. And then in the very same breath, he excoriates the tithers for their total lack of mercy. They are absolutely, scrupulously faithful to God, and they are totally indifferent to their neighbors. So, what is their tithing worth? Nothing. It's not what God is looking for. Very similar thing happens in this morning's gospel. Rich people are tithing their gold and silver to the temple. They are showering 1/10 of their gold and silver into the temple treasury. And then shuffling up behind them comes a poor widow who drops 2 copper coins into the treasury. Clink, clink. It's her last 2 cents. And then seeing that, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Did you see that? That widow has given more out of her poverty than everyone else gave out of their abundance." It's not about the amount. Possibly, it's about the percentage. but the tithe is no longer being commended. I think there were three things, at least, going on in that story. The first and most superficial thing is that the tithing is superficial. The tithers are superficial. The story begins with Jesus talking about people who like to be admired for their long public prayers. Now we are meeting with people who like to be admired for their big public tithes. The second thing, which is a little bit more substantial, is that none of the tithers display any mercy. There they are, with 90% of their gold and silver still in their pockets, and there she is, who just coughed up her last 2 cents. And none pay her any attention. Everybody tithes. Nobody gives alms. Everybody is faithful to God and totally indifferent to their penniless neighbor. Third and most substantial is the faith of the widow who does not tithe. She can't tithe. There's no way to extract 10% from 2 copper coins. There is, however, a way to extract 50% from 2 coins. She chooses instead to give 100. She gives all that she has in gratitude for all that she had. And then she trusts God to meet her needs. It's not about the amount, but at this point, it's not even about the percentage. It's not even about giving. It's about being given. That's the difference between the widow and everyone who ignores her. That's why some pastors don't teach tithing as an expectation. Okay, I wouldn't argue with those who do, because I think there's a biblical warrant for doing it, but the biblical witness is that giving doesn't begin with tithing. Giving begins with gratitude. And as soon as tithing hardens into a commandment, it ceases to be an expression of gratitude, and it just becomes a duty, or a demand, or a display, or a tax, or a way of paying God off, or a way of buying God's blessing. All the money in the world is not enough to buy God's blessing, because it's for free. He doesn't sell it. It's a gift. What does our great high priest of peace do when he gives us bread and wine and blessing? Why is he doing that? Is it to reward us for our great generosity? Is it payment to us for our great faithfulness? Or do you think he's trying to buy our gratitude? Okay, what he gives is not given in exchange for any of that. His sacrifice was made in the total absence of all of that. He gives to people who have nothing to give. And that's why he gives bread and wine and blessing, body and blood and life. These things are given expressly to the ungrateful, so that we might learn gratitude. They are given expressly to the stingy, so that we might learn generosity. They are given to the unfaithful, so that we might begin to learn to trust him. And he doesn't give us a percentage. He's not a 10% giver. He's not even a 90% giver. He gives all that he has and all that he is, so that we can become more like him, so that we can grow to become more like him. Believers who become givers. Givers who learn to be given. Giving is something we grow up and into. Being given is something we grow up and into. But giving is something that grows us. Giving people grow. Growing people give. That's a Christian truth. It's also an ancient Hebrew truth. But it's not an exclusively religious truth. It's a universal truth. Unbelievers know the truth about that every bit as much as we do. It's just that inside the church and inside the synagogue, we have a religious explanation for the universal phenomenon. Giving people grow because we were made in the image of a giving God who gives sacrificially. Okay. People who give grow to be more like God. Giving freely grows us more and more like Christ. The more freely we give, the more we grow to be like him. As somebody who tithes, I commend the practice to you as a discipline that does give growth. But giving is not about hitting a number. If we're shooting for a percentage, we're missing the point. We give to show gratitude. Short of that, we give to grow in gratitude. That's what giving teaches. If we're striving for growth, percentages can be helpful. Not because there's a magic number, not because percentages are by themselves spiritual, but working with percentages can help some of us think about growing by stages, by seasons, gradually, naturally, according to what we each feel called to give. I wouldn't want anybody to give anything more than that. And I wouldn't want anybody to give anything less than that. I want us each to give enough to help us grow. Okay. I want us to be people who give, not people who pay. People who pay feel entitled to what they pay for. People who give feel gratitude for what they've received. Just as a general rule, people who give show mercy. People who pay God off, as a rule, don't. Because people who pay for their mercy expect everybody else to pay for theirs. People who give know mercy as a gift. And they show it by sharing it. It doesn't matter to me how much you give. It doesn't matter to me what percentage you give. I just want you to have peace with whatever you give. Giving is the foundation for peace. Giving is Yeru Shalom.